My name is Amanda, and from the outside, my life appears flawless. I live in a beautiful house with a large garden, married to Michael, a successful attorney who has worked at a prestigious firm for many years. We have everything one could wish for: stability, comfort, and the admiration of those around us. Our friends and family see us as the perfect couple, one to be envied. But no one, except me, knows that behind this facade lies emptiness and disappointment. At first, our marriage truly felt like a fairy tale. Michael knew how to surprise me with romantic dates and gifts for no reason. We traveled extensively: Italy, France, Japan. He wanted to show me the world. I remember us lying on a beach somewhere along the Baltic coast, and he told me he dreamed of having children with me, children who would be as curious and creative as I was. At that moment, I felt like the happiest person on earth. But over time, things started to change. Michael became deeply immersed in his work, his career, extra projects, and ambitions of becoming a partner at his firm. Coming home at 10 p.m. or later became the norm. Conversations over dinner turned into monotonous "How was your day?" And on weekends, we barely saw each other because he had urgent matters to handle. I tried to stay optimistic, reminding myself that this was temporary. But months passed and nothing changed. We used to dream about having children, but every time I brought it up, Michael would say, "Maybe later. Now isn't the right time. I need to establish myself at work first." I began to feel lonely, even while lying next to the man I once loved more than anything. Our intimacy became rare, and when it did happen, it felt like a formality, devoid of passion and warmth. I started spending more time lost in my own thoughts. A question haunted me: is this really all I deserve? Is this what marriage is supposed to be? One evening, when Michael was late again, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the cold dinner I had prepared just for myself. And that was when I realized my life had become a golden cage, beautiful on the outside but empty, without soul or passion. I repeatedly tried to talk to Michael. I suggested weekend getaways, short trips, date nights at a restaurant, but every time, he found an excuse. It's report season. A client needed an urgent meeting. There's a promotion contest at the firm. Sometimes he would apologize and say, "Of course, sweetheart. As soon as things settle down, we'll make up for it." But that promise never turned into action. My best friend, Sarah, noticed the changes in my mood. She bluntly asked me, "Are you still happy with him?" Back then, I didn't know how to answer. Maybe before, I would have said, "Yes, this is just a rough patch," but now I couldn't. Inside me, the feeling grew stronger that I was losing myself in a marriage with a man who no longer saw me. Deep down, I felt like there had to be more emotions, more love, more life. But I didn't know what that more was supposed to be. Was it a new hobby? Another man? Or simply my own self-discovery? These thoughts crept into my mind, ones I tried to push away, but with each passing day, they became louder. And so, I found myself standing at an invisible threshold, beyond which something new and dangerous awaited. My story had not yet turned into a full-blown drama, but the foundations for one were already in place. Indifference and loneliness in a perfect marriage, a longing to feel alive again, and the lack of strength to change things the conventional way. After several unsuccessful attempts to talk to Michael, I realized that our conversations felt more like monologues, my words dissolving into his yeah, I'm busy. Instead, I started spending more time outside the house, sometimes working late, sometimes just wandering through the city. I needed to feel at least some sense of freedom from the suffocating routine of our marriage. One day, my boss asked me to attend a business meeting with a potential partner, a creative agency specializing in corporate events and advertising campaigns. I arrived at their office and waited in the lobby, admiring the colorful posters on the walls. That's when a tall, confident man with a charismatic smile approached me. "Hi, I'm Andrew, the creative director." "You must be Amanda," he said, extending his hand. "Yes," I smiled. "Nice to meet you." There was something captivating about his posture, his way of speaking, and the way he looked at me, like I was someone worth noticing. It felt unusual because Michael hadn't looked at me that way in years, as if I were something special. We moved to the conference room, where Andrew presented the concept for the event we were set to collaborate on. But I noticed that he wasn't just addressing the team, he was speaking to me directly. His jokes landed in a way that made me feel included, and I sensed an undeniable chemistry forming between us. As the meeting wrapped up and we walked out of the office together, Andrew turned to me and said, "You have great ideas, Amanda. It would be interesting to work more closely with you." I smiled. "I hope we'll have the opportunity." But that wasn't enough for him. "If you have time, we could grab a coffee, or even dinner sometime. I'd love to get a better understanding of your perspective on this project," he said, his voice sincere, but with a hint of playful flirtation in his eyes. I hesitated. On one hand, this was just professional interaction. On the other, I could feel the underlying tension, the kind that was both thrilling and dangerous. Something inside me was already drawn to the warmth and ease he exuded, a stark contrast to the cold distance I had grown accustomed to with Michael. When I returned home, I found Michael once again buried in work. He didn't even notice me walk in, only giving me a quick nod, as if to say, "Hey." I recalled how Andrew had practically devoured me with his gaze, how he kept joking even when I tried to keep things strictly professional. And that's when it hit me. Michael hadn't shown me that kind of admiration in years. Later that night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, all I could see was Andrew's smile and the way our eyes locked during our conversation. Had I already betrayed my husband in my thoughts? Perhaps it wasn't a full betrayal yet, but it was definitely the beginning of something that challenged my moral boundaries. The next morning, I received an email from Andrew thanking me for the meeting. At the end of his message, he added a personal note. "Amanda, you impress me not just as a professional, but as a person. I hope our collaboration will be an enjoyable one." I felt my heart skip a beat. It was subtle, yet unmistakably personal. Something that went beyond the standards, "Thank you." As I crafted my reply, I carefully chose my words, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. But deep down, I already knew something was beginning. Something I wouldn't have been tempted by if I were truly happy at home. After that short but thrilling exchange of messages with Andrew, I subconsciously started looking for reasons to see him again. At first, it was quick conversations at the office when he occasionally stopped by to discuss project details. Then, our messages became increasingly personal, sent after work, in the evenings, and sometimes even late at night. One afternoon, Andrew called me during my lunch break. "Amanda, sorry for the sudden call, but I'm near your office. Want to grab lunch together? I have a few ideas for our next event." I felt a rush of excitement, but answered with feigned calmness. "Of course, why not? Give me 5 minutes." We walked to a small restaurant nearby. Our business discussion quickly shifted to personal topics. Andrew shared how he had dreamed of running his own creative agency since college, but, for now, was limited to working for others. In return, I talked about my dream of traveling through Europe and starting a family, a dream that Michael and I had repeatedly postponed for someday. "Michael must be a very busy man," Andrew noted when I mentioned that my husband was a lawyer. "Yes," I sighed. "Lately, work has consumed his entire life." There was understanding in Andrew's gaze, perhaps even a hint of sympathy. And I felt something warm stirring inside me. He saw me in a way I had longed to be seen for so long. Our lunch break stretched longer than expected, and we barely made it back to work on time. As we parted ways, Andrew lightly brushed his fingers against my hand. The touch was so subtle it could have been accidental, but I felt an electric spark rush through me. That evening, I anxiously waited for a message from him, and it came. Today's lunch was even better than I expected. Thank you for sharing a piece of yourself with me. I smiled as I scrolled through my phone, sitting next to Michael, who didn't even glance up to ask who I was texting. His emotional distance was the final push that drew me even closer to Andrew. A few days later, Andrew was more direct. Amanda, I know a great restaurant. How about dinner tonight to celebrate our project's success? I knew this wouldn't be a business dinner. All day at work, my mind replayed different scenarios. Am I already betraying Michael's? I wondered, but the desire to feel something more than emptiness at home overpowered my doubts. That evening, I told Michael I'd be staying late at work due to extra tasks. His response was indifferent. All right, call me if anything. For me, that was just another confirmation that I hardly mattered to him anymore. Andrew and I sat in a cozy corner of the restaurant, dimly lit by soft, warm lighting. He ordered wine, effortlessly kept the conversation flowing, and asked me questions I had longed to answer, but had no one to share them with. We talked about childhood dreams, our fears, and what life might have been like had we chosen different paths. Are you happy, Amanda? He suddenly asked, looking straight into my eyes. I hesitated for a few seconds before exhaling. I'm not sure. Lately, it feels like life is happening around me, but I'm not really part of it. Andrew leaned in closer. You deserve better. His words felt like an invitation, a promise of something new. And at that moment, our knees touched under the table, a small, subtle movement, but it meant something much bigger for both of us. After dinner, he called a taxi for me. We stood on the sidewalk, waiting. The cold evening breeze made me instinctively step closer to him. He looked at me and slightly tilted his head, as if studying my reaction. My heart pounded. Amanda, he began but didn't finish, because I couldn't stop myself. I leaned in and pressed my lips to his. It was soft and brief, almost like a test, but it felt so natural. A surge of adrenaline and guilt washed over me at the same time. Such a fleeting moment, but it left no room to turn back. Andrew gently brushed his fingers against my cheek, and just then, the taxi arrived. As I rode home, my hands trembled. I knew I had just taken my first real step toward betrayal. After my first kiss with Andrew, my life seemed to split into two parallel realities. At home, there was me and Michael, surrounded by cold silence. At work, there was me and Andrew, filled with passion and hidden glances, as if we existed in our own intimate universe. I started coming up with excuses to see him more often: business meetings, discussions of important projects, and late nights at the office. On one hand, I felt an emotional high I hadn't experienced in my relationship with Michael for a long time. Small messages from Andrew wishing me good morning or sweet dreams made me smile, even when I was sitting right next to my husband. It felt as if Andrew was the only one who truly saw me, my dreams, my fears, my hunger for life. One evening, when we once again stayed late at the office, Andrew opened a bottle of champagne under the pretense of celebrating a successful project milestone. I knew it was just an excuse. We sat together in the large conference room, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from his. You're looking at me like you want to say something, I whispered, my voice trembling. Say something, he smirked, gently touching my hand. I'd rather show you. Everything escalated faster than I could have imagined. That night was our first real moment of intimacy. I felt a muted guilt, but the passion overpowered any doubt. When I returned home late that night, I found Michael already asleep. Standing in the dimly lit bedroom, I looked at him and felt a sharp pang of remorse. But instead of making me want to confess or stop, it strangely intensified my desire to relive the thrill of risk and passion. I began justifying my actions to myself, convincing myself that Michael was also to blame. He had neglected me for too long. At the same time, an underlying fear crept into my mind. What if he notices changes in my behavior? What if some small detail, like a smudge of lipstick or the lingering scent of Andrew's cologne, gave me away? I started taking extra precautions, changing clothes immediately, washing off any scents, and turning off my phone when I was with Andrew to avoid receiving any calls from my husband. Michael started sensing that something was off. One evening, when I returned home from another late meeting at 11 p.m., he was waiting for me in the living room, the lamp beside him casting a soft glow. "Amanda, I don't recognize you anymore. You've become distant. You're always at work. Why don't you tell me anything anymore?" His voice carried a mix of pain and helplessness. I scrambled to come up with another excuse, something about a difficult period at work and how I needed to prove myself for a promotion. Michael didn't press further, but I could see the seed of doubt in his eyes. Meanwhile, things with Andrew had deepened. Our conversations were no longer just about work, but about life, childhood, and our unfulfilled dreams. What started as a flirtation had turned into an emotional attachment. One night, Andrew finally admitted something that stunned me. He was married too. He explained that his own marriage had been devoid of connection for years, that he, too, had been searching for something to fill the emptiness. It was ironic. We were both using each other to escape our broken realities. Yet every time I left Andrew, I had to return to Michael. I saw hope in his eyes. Perhaps he thought this was just a rough patch and that things would soon get better. But with every passing day, my comparisons between him and Andrew became more evident. And they were never in Michael's favor. Michael had started watching me with a look that felt like he was trying to solve a mystery. He didn't ask direct questions, but I could feel his tension. Once, we could spend evenings watching shows together or simply talking, but now we each stayed in separate rooms, he in his office and I in the bedroom. The warmth in our home had vanished. One evening, I had left my charger in Michael's car. When he returned home, he asked with a hint of sarcasm, "Darling, why is your charger in my car? You always say you're staying late at the office." At first, I didn't understand what he was talking about because I always carried my charger with me. But then, with a jolt of panic, I remembered. I had borrowed his car last week to meet Andrew after work. I quickly lied, saying I had stopped by a store, but my response wasn't convincing. I saw a flicker in Michael's eyes. He knew I was hiding something. A few days later, while I was in the bathroom, Michael must have glanced at my laptop. I had left it open on a chat window in my corporate messenger. When I returned, he looked deep in thought but simply said he had to go back to the office for urgent work. His sudden departure felt suspicious. I immediately checked my laptop and saw that my messages were minimized, but the possibility that he had read some of them made my stomach drop. Had he seen lines like, "Miss you so much, can't wait for our next meeting. Seeing your smile makes my day better." If he had, there was no doubt now. He knew something. That evening, I rushed to see Andrew. I needed to warn him that Michael was onto us. We met in a small cafe on the other side of town, where no one we knew would see us. "Andrew, I'm scared. I feel like Michael is about to find out everything," I said, gripping my coffee cup so tightly it nearly cracked. "Calm down. If we need to, we can lay low for a while, but you're not thinking of ending this, are you?" His voice was both soft and insistent. I don't know," I whispered, looking into his eyes. He took my hand. "I don't want to lose you, Amanda. You make me feel alive, and I can see this means something to you too." That familiar wave of passion rushed over me again, but at the same time, I knew the risk was getting too high. When I returned to the apartment, Michael was sitting in the living room with the TV turned off, staring at the wall. When he saw me, he frowned but didn't say a word. His silence was worse than shouting, because I had no idea what was running through his mind. On the kitchen counter, I found a note from him. "Don't bother with excuses. Tomorrow evening we need to talk." A cold chill spread through my body. He wanted to hear the truth. Was I ready to confess? Or would I continue the lie, hoping to salvage our marriage? For the first time since my affair with Andrew began, I seriously questioned whether it was worth it. But my feelings for him, intense and electrifying, were too strong to let go just yet. The next evening, as I approached the door of our apartment, I felt like I was going to faint from anxiety. My mind played out different scenarios. Maybe Michael would explode in anger. Maybe he would demand an immediate confession. Or worse, maybe he had already packed his bags and left for good. Everything at home looked surprisingly calm. Michael was sitting in the kitchen, his arms folded on the table. No shouting, no loud music, not even the television. Just dim lighting. I sat down across from him, feeling my heart pounding in my throat. "Hi, Michael," I whispered, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. "Hi, Amanda. I hope this time you'll be honest with me," he said, looking straight into my eyes. "I want to hear the truth," he continued. "I've already seen enough to know that something is wrong between us. I've noticed your constant late nights, your strange behavior. Can you tell me what's really going on?" I tried to answer as calmly as possible. "Lately, I've had a lot of projects at work. I'm throwing myself into them too." My voice faltered, and I realized my excuse sounded pathetic. Michael placed his phone on the table, the screen displaying a chat window. I recognized fragments of my messages with Andrew. "Why don't you tell me who you're texting late at night? And why do these messages sound like something more than just colleagues talking?" My throat went dry. I didn't want a direct confrontation, but Michael kept pushing. "I don't want to play games. Tell me the truth. Are you cheating on me? Is it that guy, Andrew?" This was the moment I realized there was no escape. My excuses, late meetings, working overtime, just a friend, weren't going to work anymore. We had reached the point of no return. "Michael," I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "Things between us haven't been the same for a long time. I felt like you were pushing me away." His eyebrow lifted, and I saw anger flicker in his expression. "So, you found someone else? You didn't even try to talk to me seriously. What was your plan? Were you going to ask for a divorce? Or did you think you could just keep lying forever?" I didn't want to admit everything, but I finally confessed. "Yes, I've been seeing someone from work. It started slowly, and I never planned for this to happen, but I felt so alone." His eyes burned with fury. "Alone? And what about me? You think I didn't feel alone? I was working to give us a better future, and in return, you—" He stopped mid-sentence, clenching his fists as if trying to contain his anger. We sat in silence for a few minutes before he finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "We have two options. First, we divorce immediately. Second, we try to fix this if you end things with him. But you need to understand that after this betrayal, we'd have to rebuild trust from the ground up." I felt my heart tighten. Could I really leave Andrew behind after getting used to his warmth and passion? And could I rebuild trust with Michael, the man I had blamed for being distant for so long? I started, but the words wouldn't come. Michael stood up and picked up his phone. "Take some time to think. But I'm not waiting forever. Either you come back to me, or you go to him. I refuse to live in a triangle." He walked out of the room, leaving me completely drained. I lowered my head onto the table, realizing for the first time exactly where my betrayal had led, to a crisis that I might not be able to escape, no matter how hard I tried. After my conversation with Michael, my world felt frozen in place. I wished I could wake up and realize it was just a bad dream, but reality was too sharp to ignore. I had to pull myself together, to go to work where Andrew was waiting for me, and to come home to Michael, who was both hurt and betrayed. Both men had expectations, but what did I truly want? The next morning, I texted Andrew, "We need to talk." We arranged to meet during lunch at the cafe, where we usually sat in our secluded corner. When he arrived, he looked somewhat tense. I wasted no time in telling him that Michael had found out everything and had given me an ultimatum. Either I end things with Andrew and stay with Michael, or we get divorced. Andrew took my hand. "Amanda, I understand what you're feeling right now, but you told me yourself that there hasn't been real love between you and Michael for a long time. Are you truly happy with him?" Confusion flooded over me. No, I hadn't been happy with Michael for some time, but would I really be happier if I threw everything away and went to Andrew, a man who was also married and had his own commitments? I don't know if I'm ready to give up everything Michael and I have built, I sighed. Andrew frowned. "And are you ready to give up on us? I know we could be happy together if circumstances didn't hold us back." Feeling lost, I called my closest friend, Sarah. She was one of the few people who had noticed how I had been disappearing from my own life, but she didn't know about the affair. Now, I finally had the courage to tell her. Sarah's reaction was mixed, disappointment at the betrayal, but also compassion for my pain. "Amanda, only you can decide what's more important, your feelings for Andrew or your marriage to Michael," she said. "I'm afraid of making the wrong choice and regretting it for the rest of my life," I admitted. That night, Michael came home from work and placed a folder in front of me. My stomach clenched. I thought they were divorce papers. But when I opened it, I saw our joint bank accounts, our mortgage, and other financial documents. He spoke calmly but firmly. "If you decide to leave, I won't stop you. But you have a right to half of everything we built together." His voice was cold, as if he had already accepted the outcome. "Are you really just giving up?" I asked, trying to hold back tears. "I'm tired, Amanda. If you love someone else, I don't see the point in forcing you to stay." Left alone, I couldn't sleep. My marriage, flawed as it was a part of my life, my memories, my history with Michael. And my affair with Andrew had given me emotions I hadn't felt in years. But was that enough to justify leaving everything behind? I thought about the early years with Michael, our travels, our dreams of children, the tenderness that once felt endless. And then I remembered Andrew's eyes when he said, "I want to be with you." That night, I realized I could no longer just go with the flow. My decision would change all of our lives. But which choice would bring less pain? Should I stay in a marriage where passion had long faded, or take a risk and go to Andrew, a man with whom everything had started in deception? Several days had passed since Michael showed me the documents and asked me to decide. I walked around in a daze, trying to understand who I was now and what I wanted from life. Thoughts of Andrew wouldn't leave me alone, but at the same time, the hurt in Michael's eyes haunted me. One morning, while getting ready for work, I suddenly felt nauseous and dizzy. At first, I thought it was just stress. So many sleepless nights, inner turmoil, and fears could easily take a toll on my body. But the nausea returned again and again, especially in the mornings. That evening, when I got home, I felt lightheaded once more and had to sit down to avoid falling over. Michael wasn't home. He had been disappearing lately too, perhaps trying to avoid me so he wouldn't have to see the deception in my eyes. I was left alone with a strange feeling that something was happening to my body beyond just stress. The next morning, while running errands in the city, I stopped by a pharmacy without fully believing what I was doing. I bought a pregnancy test. It was an impulsive decision, but I couldn't ignore the changes I felt. When I got home, I took the test. Those few minutes of waiting felt like an eternity. And when I finally saw the two bright lines, heat rushed through my body. The biggest question pounded in my head: whose child is this? After all, in recent months, I had barely been with Michael, and my emotional and physical attachment had been entirely to Andrew. I sat on the bathroom floor with the test in my hands and felt the tears streaming uncontrollably down my cheeks. I imagined telling Michael about this. Should I tell him at all? And what about Andrew? He was also married, and there was no guarantee he would want to take responsibility for my pregnancy. I sat there, wondering how I hadn't realized this sooner. Maybe all the stress had distracted me from the signals my own body was sending. But now, everything had become even more complicated. An affair was one thing. An affair could be explained, justified, even hidden. But a child? This wasn't just about my desires anymore. This was another life at stake. Not knowing who else to trust, I called Sarah. She arrived that evening, finding me in an almost hysterical state. I couldn't hide the test results. I simply showed her the small piece of paper with the two undeniable lines. Sarah was shocked. "Amanda, I don't even know what to say." "There's almost no chance that it's Michael's," I whispered. "You know we've barely been together lately." She exhaled sharply. "God, and Andrew's? I don't even know if he'd be happy about this," I sighed. Sarah suggested I at least go to a clinic for a professional test and determine how far along I was. But more importantly, I needed to decide what to tell my husband. Michael came home later than usual that night. He noticed Sarah leaving quickly, sensing something was off. I sat on the couch, clutching the pregnancy test in my pocket, unsure whether I should tell him right then and there. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, noticing my nervousness. It's nothing." I decided to postpone the conversation. "I'm fine. Are you sure? Or is there something I should know?" There was doubt in his voice. I just shook my head. I couldn't say it, at least not today. The thought that this child was, with high probability, not his destroyed me from the inside. Since discovering I was pregnant, I had lived in constant fear. Fear for the child and fear of my affair being exposed. I knew this could destroy my life, Michael's life, and even Andrew's. But delaying the truth was no longer an option. Each passing day made it harder to keep this a secret. For days, I couldn't gather the strength to tell Andrew about the pregnancy. But the more I avoided him, the more he noticed my distance. Finally, I called him. "I need to talk to you. It's important. Please meet me after work today." He responded immediately. "Of course. Let's meet at our cafe." My hands trembled as I approached the table where he was already waiting. Andrew immediately noticed my anxiety. "Amanda, you look pale. What's wrong?" I sat across from him, took a deep breath, and blurted out, "I'm pregnant." His eyes widened in shock. For a few seconds, he just stared, as if struggling to process what I had just said. "And are you sure that he began, but stopped himself, realizing the weight of his question. I nodded silently. Michael and I had barely been intimate for months. The answer was obvious. He ran a hand over his face, clearly overwhelmed. "Listen, this is huge," he finally said, looking away. "I have a family, you know that. And this is so complicated." "I know," I sighed. "I'm not asking you to drop everything immediately, but I need to know, are you willing to accept this? To be a father?" His eyes showed more fear than joy. He took my hand, and I felt a slight tremble in his fingers.
"Give me time.
I can't just process this overnight. I need to think." I understood his hesitation. It was justified. But that didn't make it hurt any less. What else did I expect? I asked myself. That evening, when I returned home, I found Michael standing in the hallway. In his hands, he held my medical records from the clinic where I had confirmed my pregnancy. I must have carelessly left them in my bag, or maybe he found them by accident. His face was pale with shock and anger. "You're pregnant." His voice echoed through the empty corridor. "And why am I finding out from paperwork instead of from you?" I froze, unable to say a word. It felt as if the entire world had stopped. I tried to form an explanation, but nothing came out. But the most terrifying part? He was looking at me in a way that told me he already knew the unspoken answer. Is this child even mine? I barely whispered. I just found out. I didn't have the chance to tell you yet. Michael's face hardened with pain. Amanda, we've barely been together in months. You know just as well as I do that this baby might not be mine. Tears welled in my eyes. I shook my head, knowing that lying was pointless. Please don't yell. I was going to tell you, but everything is so complicated. Complicated? His voice rose, unable to contain his anger anymore. Do you understand what this means? How could you do this to me? I stood there, drowning in guilt and despair. But Michael wasn't even searching for answers anymore, because the truth was obvious. And now what? He threw the medical papers onto the floor. Are you even planning to keep the baby? Is this going to be my child or your lover's? I don't know, I whispered, collapsing onto a chair in the hallway. I just don't know. He turned abruptly and stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. I stayed there, sitting alone in the hallway, painfully aware that my entire life had just exploded in an instant. When the storm finally erupted and the truth was spoken aloud, I realized there was no turning back. Michael and Andrew now stood on opposite sides of my shattered life, and I had to decide how to move forward, either remain in the ruins or find the strength to rebuild. 2 days after Michael found out about the pregnancy, Andrew showed up at our house. I was shocked. He had never come here before, as we had always kept our affair hidden. When Michael saw him at the door, he nearly lost control. Do you even understand what you've done? Michael spat, his fists clenched. Listen, I came to talk, Andrew said, trying to keep his composure, though his voice carried unease. I stepped between them, pleading for them to calm down. Eventually, we moved to the living room, where Andrew tried to explain himself. Amanda, I don't want to walk away from you, or this child. Yes, I'm married, but if this baby is mine, I'm ready to take responsibility. Michael looked at him with disgust. And what exactly do you plan to do? Leave your wife and raise my child? Or dump everything on Amanda's? I realized we couldn't move forward without a paternity test. It was the only logical step to determine who the real father was. But deep inside, I already knew Michael's chances of being the father were slim. Andrew suggested we visit a doctor immediately to conduct the necessary tests, though it was still early in the pregnancy, making it difficult and risky. Meanwhile, Michael looked humiliated, as if he was being forced into a situation he wanted no part of. Tensions escalated when Michael aggressively shoved Andrew. Get out of my house, he barked. I stepped in between them, desperately trying to stop the fight before it turned violent. In the end, I insisted that we needed to handle this maturely, without physical aggression. If you want me to leave, Amanda, I will, Andrew said, looking at me with a mix of pain and despair. But I won't walk away from my child if they're mine. Michael clenched his jaw, but refrained from lashing out further. Andrew left, and the house fell into a suffocating silence filled with rage, uncertainty, and fear of what was to come. That night, I sat on the couch for hours, staring at the dark television screen. Michael was locked in the bedroom. I wasn't sure if he was asleep or, like me, lost in his own turmoil. I knew that everything now rested on my decision. If the test showed Michael was the father, which was unlikely, we could attempt to rebuild our marriage. But after such betrayal, would it be too fragile to survive? If Andrew was the father, I had to decide whether to be with him, knowing he was still married and there was no guarantee he would leave his wife for me. The third option, leave both men behind and raise the baby alone. But did I have the strength to do that? This was no longer just a story about infidelity. Now an innocent life was at stake. The next morning, Michael walked out of the bedroom with a suitcase in hand. For a brief moment, I thought he was leaving for good, but instead he explained, "I'm going to stay with a friend for a few days, until we figure this out." He hesitated at the door, then finally said, "Amanda, I love you, even after everything. But I don't know if I have the strength to raise this child if they aren't mine." And then he was gone. I stood alone in the empty house, knowing that I had reached the final breaking point. Ahead lay either a paternity test, divorce, and painful decisions, or some impossible compromise that I couldn't yet envision. After Michael left with his suitcase and Andrew stopped trying to force his way into my life, I was left alone with a new reality. I was pregnant, and I had to make the decision I had been avoiding for weeks. On one side was a life with Michael, where emotional closeness had long faded. On the other was Andrew, who had reignited passion in me, but could not promise to stay with me and the baby. Most importantly, I had to decide whether there was room for anyone else in my future besides my child. I took a break from work and spent time thinking. I remembered how I had once loved Michael with all my heart, our romantic trips, his care, and his promises. But I also recalled the coldness of recent years, his detachment, and how his career always took priority over our relationship. With Andrew, my feelings were a mixture of guilt and tenderness. He had made me feel wanted and loved again, but our affair had been built on lies and betrayal. His own marriage and his hesitation to take responsibility for our child left me without any guarantees of a stable future. I finally decided to take the test to determine the baby's father. The doctors warned me that at this stage, there were risks, but I felt it was the only way for all of us to find clarity. The results were unsurprising. Andrew was the biological father. When I told him, he was silent for a few seconds before saying, "I can't leave my wife and everything I have, but I don't want to abandon you or the baby. I'm willing to provide financial support and be there, but please don't ask me to divorce her. I can't do that right now." His words crushed any last illusions I had about us becoming a family. When I told Michael that he was not the father, I saw a strange relief in his eyes, as if he had already known but had still held on to hope. He arrived at our final conversation with divorce papers already prepared, though his expression showed hesitation. "Amanda, if you want me to stay, I will," he said, though his voice carried pain. "But you know our life will never be the same again." I couldn't believe he was willing to forgive and even raise a child that wasn't his. But I knew that even if I agreed, our relationship would be eaten away by distrust and lingering pain. "Michael, you are too good of a person." But I couldn't live knowing that every day you would be reminded of my betrayal. And I don't think I could be happy with you either, knowing the guilt would never go away. He nodded, wiping away invisible tears. "Then I guess this is goodbye." After signing the divorce papers, I packed my things and moved into a small apartment in another part of the city. Andrew tried to offer help, but I refused everything except minimal financial support. I didn't want to depend on him, knowing he was still living with his wife and that our relationship had lost any purity. I decided to start over, without a husband, without a lover, but with my child, whom I now promised to protect and love for both parents. Maybe it was the hardest path, to leave both men behind, but I felt that this choice gave me true freedom. Freedom from lies, fear, and other people's expectations. A few months later, I would give birth to a baby girl and name her Grace, a tribute to the grace I wanted to return to my life. Neither Michael nor Andrew would be there during the delivery, but I would face it with my head held high, knowing this was the result of my own choice, to live honestly, even if it meant enduring betrayal and the destruction of my old life. Would those around me ever forgive me? Would I ever find love again? Those questions remained unanswered. But I knew one thing for certain. My future was now in my hands, and I was no longer afraid of being alone, because within me, a new life had begun, one I was ready to fight for.
Please subscribe to our channel Stellar Stories. We have new amazing stories coming out every day. Thank you.